Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion. Not a continuing discussion, a new discussion. Wait a minute. Pause. Roll it back a little bit. Let's go ahead and calm down. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom on a snow day of all things, right? I know, it's absolutely wild. I never thought in my life that I would be saying the word snow day in New Orleans, right? But apparently I am. So we'll talk all about that stuff and about all the fun that y'all had in the snow and about how y'all's first time really experiencing a snow day was when we get back to class. I'm betting next week, all right? That's my bet anyway. Now, if we get back at all, I think we'll be back by Friday. But going into it, though, what you have to understand is you're going to have this one flip, all right? This one flip that you'll need to have done by 6 p.m. tomorrow on Thursday, okay? This one flip will also be going over a new topic, right? We are beginning to actually go away from the effects of the French Revolution and all the things going on in the continent, and we're going to move to something new. And we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution that's going to span from 1730 to 1830. Now, you have to understand the Industrial Revolution, first and foremost, is going to be going on before the French Revolution ever even took place. As you can tell with this year right here being 1730, right? Because the French Revolution didn't start until 1789 in France, okay? So that means there is a lot of stuff that we got to kind of decipher, decode, and go over to completely understand this movement that is going to sweep across the entirety of the continent and cause some of the most major innovations that history will ever see. So the thing that you have to understand before we can even keep moving, though, is besides the fact that we're traveling back in time again, which drives a lot of y'all nuts, we have to understand and define what the Industrial Revolution is, right? And this is also one of those things that's so nice because so many of y'all know so much about it already, right? The Industrial Revolution is a term coined in the 1830s by the second wave of the Industrial Revolution to describe the burst of major innovations and economic expansion that took place in Europe, all right? Now, it's going to be mostly pertaining to cotton textiles and iron production, right? So most of the two largest fields that will be affected by the Industrial Revolution, especially the Industrial Revolution that will occur in Europe, is going to be the production of textiles or cloth, and then also in iron. Now, it's not limited specifically to those things because there's a lot of other stuff that comes in the wake of this, including railroads that we'll talk about later in this flip and several other things. But what you need to realize is that the big era of innovation will surround cotton textiles and iron production, right? Now, going into it, something we need to also understand, though, is Mr. Terry, but if this was going on during the 1700s, how come we haven't heard about it yet? A lot of it has to do with where it went down, okay? So it is going to occur in Britain, all right? So now, Great Britain is going to be what it's referred to by 1803. And so what we have to understand, though, is that England is going to be the home of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a lot of reasons as to why people in France and the Holy Roman Empire had no clue that this was happening in Britain while it was going down. Keep that in the back of your mind, all right? All of this stuff that we're about to talk about was going down in Britain unbeknownst to France and the Holy Roman Empire and Spain and Portugal and all the other figures and countries on the continent itself. But the better question that you really, really have to ask yourself is why Britain, right? Why is Britain going to be the home of the Industrial Revolution? I'm going to give you about 4 major reasons why right now. Number 1, their extremely large colonial empire, okay? Their very, very large colonial empire is going to make them one of the biggest reasons why they are able to have the Industrial Revolution, because they have not only a lot of products coming in through their ports, but also they have a lot of raw materials that can be grown in a lot of different areas, right? Because it takes all the way up until 1776 when the Americans break away, until when the British finally lose the access to timber that is coming out of Canada and the cotton textile or the raw cotton that's coming out of the Americas. Now, another big reason why Britain is going to be home to the Industrial Revolution has to do with its very large and ready workforce, right? It has a very large and prepared workforce ready to go. Because remember, the agricultural revolution occurred in Britain and in the Netherlands. What's going to happen, though, because the agricultural revolution, the putting out system will take hold. When the putting out system and the cottage industry take hold, they've already created a very steady demand for cotton, and they've also created a very steady group of laborers that are now doing things other than just agricultural work all day long. Third reason why you're going to need to know this is because they are an island, all right? And the fact that they are an island gives them an island-style economy when it comes to having major ports, easy accessible ports, and also the ability to ship internationally, which will burgeon or blow the entire Industrial Revolution forward in a major way. And the fourth and probably most important reason why Britain is going to be the home of the Industrial Revolution has to do with its large deposits of iron and coal. All right, there are huge deposits of iron and coal in Britain, which is going to catapult the Industrial Revolution forward as things progress. Okay, and we'll talk about more reasons why that is. It has to do with the fact that it's close to the surface and stuff like that. But the putting out system that we had just talked about with its large workforce in Britain is going to drive a lot of innovation as well, leading to the earliest forms of what you would consider mechanization inside of some of these early factories. All right, so what I mean by that is you're going to get some inventions. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution actually really started in the putting out system, not being so industrial at first, right? What ended up happening is these families and individuals that are inside of the putting out system using these giant looms and spinning lots of thread and doing all this stuff are going to realize that spinning thread on a spinning wheel one thread at a time is really, really slow, or actually weaving one thread of one thread through the loom is really, really slow. And so it's going to lead to the discovery and to the creation of inventions that are going to speed that process up quite a bit, right? So one of the biggest ones early on is this thing known as the flying shuttle that would actually replace a child who would actually weave the thread up and over in a loom. So y'all know what a big loom is, right? Like a or like a very, very large loom is the thing that you actually make cloth with, right? It's got these two threads that go like this, and then you have to pass a thread through it and then go smack, smack, and then like it actually makes it into like a piece of cloth, or it like pushes the thread down. Well, instead of having your fingers in there going like this, the flying shuttle sat on like a little trough, or like a little like kind of like a panel or whatever, and you'd smack it, and the inside of it had a bobbin of thread right there, and so it would just go sweep and then go all the way down to the end of the loom. You go smack, smack, thwack, smack, smack, thwack, and you just keep doing it much faster, right? Instead of having a child from your home, you know, like Rosie Cardella going like and just taking forever, all right? So another big one that's going to come along, though, is now that we can actually make thread faster with the flying shuttle, we have a higher demand for thread now, so we need more of it so we can keep up with the like production of cloth. So we need to make more thread, and instead of having just, you know, I don't know, Kylie Burke at a spinning wheel going and spinning one thread at a time, now we can actually do a lot of them with this thing called the spinning jenny, which could actually spin anywhere from 10 threads at once up to 100 with some of the later designs. And all it took was one person on that handle right there just cranking away, and it would actually spin a bunch of threads all at once, all right? And then now what we have a problem with, though, is we can replace this worker, right? We got Kendall Allen over there going and just like spinning it like that. Well, let's go ahead and get rid of Kendall's job completely and replace her with water, right? And so yeah, and that right there is called the water frame. Basically, it's a spinning jenny that's attached to a water wheel connected to a stream, and the stream spins it, right? And can spin anywhere to up to 100 threads at once. And then last but not least, instead of making all this stuff out of wood, let's make it out of iron. And they created this thing called the spinning mule in 1790, which is actually going to make like yarn much thicker, right? It's going to make it a lot thicker and make it easier to actually like make higher grade cloth in larger, like weft and like larger weave cloth whenever the like Industrial Revolution continues to roll forward. So these inventions are going to be really, really big for the earliest mechanization process, all right? Now, speaking of mechanization, think about it, y'all. If I had a bunch of spinning jennies or a bunch of water frames inside of a building, I basically have a factory now, right? So these early developments and these early inventions, just because they're not putting off steam heat and just because they're not actually putting out smoke, doesn't mean that they're not still mechanized like devices in the earliest parts of the Industrial Revolution. Now, speaking of like steam heat and all this other stuff, let's talk about power real quick, okay? Now, what's going to end up happening, okay, during the Industrial Revolution, now that like more cloth is being created, and now we are in more need of iron rails for shipping and stuff like that, you have to understand that it all comes down to iron production, right? So what we need to understand really, really quickly, when you're making iron, okay, you have to smelt it. Now, I know a lot of you little Minecraft nerds over there like know exactly what smelting is, and what smelting is getting iron out of rock, right? So basically what they have to do is they have to smelt the iron out of the rock, right? And what that means is whenever you dig up a piece of iron, it's embedded inside of like sediment and rock itself. You take that, you throw it into a furnace or a blast furnace, you heat it up real hot, the iron melts while the rock stays, right? So that's the process of smelting. But really quickly, when analyzing the smelting process, you need a form of heat, or you need a source of heat, and that's our power right there, right? So what is going to provide the early earliest forms of power in the Industrial Revolution? Well, you have to understand that in the earliest revolution or forms of the Industrial Revolution, they were actually powered by water and wood. Look at the water frame. It was actually powering early like actual like water wheels that were cranking the water frame along and making thread, and wood power was primarily used in blast furnaces to create iron, all right? But the problem is that wood power is going to start running low in 1776 due to the fact that the Americans have revolutionized and broken away. So they're running out a lot of timber resources, and they need more power because they got to make this stuff, right? Iron ingots is what those are called. Again, you little Minecraft nerds know exactly what those bad boys are. It's also referred to as pig iron, right? And those are ingots of pig iron. You take a bunch of them together, you melt them down, you make them into whatever you want, right? So going into it though, since all of this wood power is running low, they start using instead coal power, right? Now, coal is going to require you to dig deep mines, right? If you're digging deep mines and going away from things like wind power and stuff like that, you have to understand that this is going to be very important. So coal, which resides underground, you got to get down there and get it, which is going to lead to the earliest development of steam engines, right? Which is huge. The very first steam engine ever designed was designed by this guy named Thomas Savery and John Newcomen, two different guys. And the purpose of the earliest steam engine was actually to go into coal mines and get water out, okay? As y'all know from living in New Orleans, if you dig a little bit deep into the ground, the hole will start filling up with water, right? Well, Thomas Savery and John Newcomen are two like Scottish inventors that actually designed this early steam engine to send buckets down into the mine and bail the water out, right? Well, the thing about it is that their earliest design was really kind of rudimentary. It lost a lot of fuel all the time. It would break very often. And so what ends up happening is a man was called in to fix one of their earliest, or like one of their steam engines. That man's name was James Watt, right? James Watt gets called in to fix one of those engines, and he creates the most modern form of the steam engine, and it's the one that we still use now, right? We still use a Watt-derived steam engine to produce electricity in the modern era, as well as just to produce like a power generator in any form, all right? James Watt, what he's going to do is he's going to actually add this part over here known as a condenser, and it will actually save some of the water and recirculate it back into the supply to make it so you can actually keep it from breaking so often. Now, James Watt, because his design was so revolutionary, like I said, would be used to produce electricity in the modern era, which is why we're referred to as electricity units as watts, right? Because it is actually produced by turbines that use steam engine principles, okay? So going into it, what you have to understand, though, is that the steam engine is then going to later on be this amazing device that could be attached to just about anything, right? It wouldn't just be used to get water out of coal mines anymore. You could slap it on the wheels, you got a locomotive, right? You could slap it onto a loom, you got a power loom now, right? All the steam engine does is it just runs a turbine, or it runs a rod, okay? And so now that you have this device that all it needs is boiling water and some coal to get it going, you can do just about anything with it. So that will lead to the explosion of railroads all over Britain as well. Rails are going to be used to move heavy carts, and they're going to come way before the locomotive, because the original locomotive actually didn't have any rails. It was basically like a very early car, and they crashed it within the first 20 minutes. And so like now you have to understand though, rails did come before the locomotive because they were used to move a lot of like heavy like coal carts around and stuff like that. But then by 1830, this guy named George Stephenson is going to come along and create this thing called the rocket, taking James Watt's steam engine and slapping it on the wheels. You got your very first locomotive that's going to lead to the explosion of railroads all over Britain. So railroads are going to now be built rapidly all over the island. This is going to be heavily pushed by Parliament as well. The government will begin to subsidize this process and heavily get involved with laying railroads all over Great Britain. They will also do this all over Europe as well in the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, which is why Europeans travel by rail so often, all right? So the thing that we have to understand, though, is that as the railroads begin to progress, we are then going to see the Industrial Revolution continue to roll forward, all right? But I'm going to clip in this flip that I recorded last year that's going to talk about a lot of the effects of the Industrial Revolution as well. Remember, this bad boy is due by Thursday at 6 p.m. You will have a Google form that goes along with this, about 5 or 6 questions that you'll need to answer. Just go ahead and bang that thing out so I know you did it. We're basically doing a reverse lesson in this whole thing. Instead of having the warm-up and then our notes in class, we're doing the flip and then the warm-up after, and then we'll lead into our next lesson a little bit later on, okay? But I hope to see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Enjoy the snow. cultural impacts throughout European history, right? But continuing to go forward, you need to also understand how this is going to affect economics, right? Now, economically speaking, this is going to be really, really big because it's going to actually benefit a lot of the government officials because Britain is going to become this workshop of the world, right? Now, by this point, Britain is going to produce 2/3 of the world's coal and half of its iron and cotton. So as you can see, they are literally the driving economic force in the world at that point, adding to that element of the British Empire. Now they're not only known for their navy, but they're also known for their economy, right? Now the other big thing that you have to understand is just the actual growth in exponential growth in industrial output. So by 1750, Britain only produced 2% of all processed and industrialized goods, but by 1860, they're producing 20% of all industrial goods and processed goods, right? That is a staggering leap forward. You're talking about 10 times the amount of production within about 110 years. So that's going to be adding mad amounts of cash to the British pockets and also benefiting so many different members of that country. Now, also, though, this is going to drive forward population because as we know, when we look at like the United States of America, Great Britain, places like Germany as well, which Germany doesn't exist yet, but it will soon, you're going to see population grow in areas that have high industrial output because of the availability of jobs, wage earning power, and things like that. So when you're looking at this, 4 times the amount of people are going to actually begin to move towards Great Britain because they had 9 million, their population will grow from 9 million to 21 million in just 70 years, okay? So as you can see, can we see why the British government pushed this movement, right? It's going to push this movement because they are just gaining so incrementally off of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is also going to have massive societal impacts. So we're now going to get into how the Industrial Revolution really, really impacts people in society, how it impacts different social classes, and how it really impacted the working class more than anybody else. So the societal impacts of the the Industrial Revolution is really going to lead to a changing of the social classes and the social strata. So this right here, of course, is just a simple sociological triangle, right, showing the differences in classes in relative to their size, right? The higher that we go up the triangle, the smaller the group gets. The lower we go, the larger it gets. And of course, relating to the Industrial Revolution, you always want to start at the top, right? Now, the upper class is still very much there, and they're the same upper class that has always been there. They are the old money. They are what is left of the old nobility. They are people that have been inheriting money throughout just decades and decades and decades of family wealth. Now, going down, though, we are seeing a massive growth of the industrial middle class. They have a huge amount of growth. The size of them is doubling, tripling over the decades because they are the factory owners, the professionals, the now educated members of society because they are actually harboring some of that profit and investing it into their families, right? So, for example, in middle-class families, you saw usually a patron or a father figure of a family risk everything they had to start a business, right? They would usually, and this is, of course, the capitalism underdog story that everybody loves so much, which is full of plot holes, but we won't get into that right now. So the thing about it, though, is you're going to see a father figure or a patriarch invest their entire life savings into a business idea. And if it continues to grow, they'll take some of that profit earnings and invest it in their own actual family. They'll send their kids off to school, they'll get them highly educated, and it's going to keep that snowball rolling down the mountain and growing in size as the middle class is beginning to get larger and larger and making more and more money. They are professionals, they're now educated, and they can actually be split into multiple different layers, right? You have upper middle class, middle class, and lower middle class, and we'll talk about those things a little bit later on, because lower middle class, for example, are your shop foremans or your higher end bosses inside of the factories. They don't own the place, but they're still having pretty solid wage earning power, right? So now industrial working class, though, or the urban working class, is the lowest out of everyone, which is your factory workers, your laborers, your miners, who can also be split into multiple different levels as well. When you're talking about your upper lower class, you're talking about people that are on the fringe of actually bumping their way up into a next class. Your working class there in the middle, and your very low class as well. Now, the scary part about this, though, is this new idea that the Industrial Revolution has brought along with it. And it's this concept known as class consciousness, which is an individual's sense of class differentiation. So for the very first time in European history, you're beginning to see in the 1800s, with the growth of the Industrial Revolution, this idea that people within lower classes know where they are, right? They know that they are poorer. They can walk down the street and see a home of a middle class individual that is much larger, much nicer, that might have workers inside of it as it is, while they're living in tenement houses and they're actually being crammed on top of each other, multiple families within one apartment. So you're seeing the growth of this urban environment leading to the concept of class consciousness. Now, this is a term coined by somebody very, very important in European history, and he is going to write a new governmental diatribe that is going to change European history for decades to come. And that guy's name is Karl Marx. K-A-R-L. Marx is spelled M-A-R-X, right? Probably one of the most important philosophers of all of European history, if not the most important political philosopher of the 1800s. Now, Karl Marx is going to be the guy that creates a governmental system in his mind known as communism, right? Him and his buddy Frederick Engels began to observe the results, the impacts of the Industrial Revolution and its impact on the regular individual. And he began to couple these impacts with the concept of class consciousness. And him and his buddy Frederick Engels, his partner, wrote diatribes about the conditions of the working class. Some of them including one book called Das Kapital, because Karl Marx is a German man. He doesn't live in Germany at this point. He lives in Prussia at this point. Now, the thing about it, though, is he eventually moves to London with Frederick Engels, where they write the most famous and important book known as the Communist Manifesto, which we will actually read a little bit later on. Now, the conditions of the working class are going to very much inspire the concepts of communism, and the seeds of communism are going to be planted during that Industrial Revolution, and those seeds will eventually sprout into a thing that will dictate the growth of certain countries for, honestly, hundreds of years to come, right? So, like, now you're talking about the entirety of the Cold War could basically be related back to the cause or the effects and causes of the Industrial Revolution and the political philosophies of Karl Marx going forward, right? Now, let's do a favor to, like, society and to the growth of history in general and take a chance to zoom in a little bit on that industrial working class, right? And talk about the two main areas where they were actually working when this Industrial Revolution began. Now, where they're beginning to work is first and foremost in these early factories. Now, this is the one that we need to understand a little bit more primarily because you're seeing a larger growth of workers in these factories. Now, first and foremost, what you have to understand is these earliest factories were actually set up in the countryside. They actually weren't originally set up in cities because they needed sources of power, right? And when we talked about those inventions, the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, and we really focused in on the water frame, the earliest factories had to be set up in the country because they needed access to running water, right? To power water wheels, to move that axle, to spin that axle on the actual water frame, to spin those bobbins into thread, right? Now, or those bobbins into thread, right? The spools or the bobbins of carded wool into thread itself. Now, these first factories being set up in the country, though, are going to also see some early reluctance to working in them, right? So something that we need to understand is that the earliest factories, there was this huge amount of fear associated with working in these early factories. Industrial working members did not want to actually leave the putting out system and go into these factories because they actually resembled what we would call an English poorhouse, right? So if we look at these two pictures right there, one of them is a factory and the other one is a poorhouse, right? And the only thing that gives away the factory being this one is the smokestack at the top, right? This thing and this thing don't look that far apart. Now, a poorhouse is basically what it was if you didn't have enough money to provide for your family, you would be moved inside of a poorhouse where you had to actually be farmed, your labor would be farmed out to other members of the community, and you were basically fed by the poorhouse. It was a governmental work known as the poorhouse system that actually inspired Charles Dickens to write Oliver Twist, right? And the poorhouses had terrible conditions of living. You had typhus and tuberculosis and diseases like that spread very rampantly through them. So you had a lot of people that didn't want to go and work in these factories at first. Even though wage earning power was a little bit higher, right? And think about why that is, all right? So think about that the reluctance to working in it is going to be mostly due to the fact that the putting out system had its own benefits, right? You could set your own time, set your own schedule. You do it when you so choose as long as the task gets done, and you can actually focus on family life and being together as a unit. Whereas there's going to be a lot of early reluctance to this because the conditions in the factories are not going to be very good. The windows don't open, there's not any ventilation, the machines don't have safety mechanisms on them to stop them if your hand gets caught inside of it. You go it's going to lead to people passing out. It's also like widespread child labor is going to be a large scale thing as well, because the earliest workers in the factories weren't even adults. It was children. They actually went to orphans and foundling hospitals and filled the factories full of them, because they were like, look, these kids need somewhere to, or like, excuse me, this orphanage needs money, and these kids are their like the biggest thing that they can use to make money. So literally factories made agreements with orphanages and foundling hospitals to employ the children in these earliest factories. And like I said, the conditions were terrible. The other place you could work inside of is the mines, right? Now, new mines are being dug all over Great Britain, and old ones are being dug deeper as demand for coal and iron began to rise. Now, not only coal and iron, but things like lead as well are going to be needed, like for the creation of paints and stuff like that, and other different products as well. But mines in general are being dug deeper than they ever have, and new ones are springing up all over the place. Now, mines are extremely dangerous to work in, and one could argue that they're more dangerous than the factories. Now, I would heavily argue that they're more dangerous than the factories. You're talking about mine collapses, cave-ins, being run over by a mine cart that weighs hundreds of pounds, which contains raw amounts of like unsmelted iron and coal. So you're talking about also explosions, gas pockets, and getting lost in practical darkness is another thing as well. They literally also had these worries of carbon monoxide poisoning. They used to hang canaries, like little birds, up in the roofs of the mines, because if the bird would pass out, that means that there's a gas leak, right? So you're talking about a very dangerous situation to work in. And originally, when the mines actually started employing people, they didn't hire just adults. They hired women, children, entire families. And the same goes for the factories as well. When the factories actually began to like basically be the only option you had to work in, the foreman didn't actually just hire the dad and the mom and like kids didn't work there. They hired entire families under contract, right? Dad would be shoveling coal, mom would be running a machine, the kids are running around picking up scraps of of undone, or scraps of cut textiles and things like that are being used with their tiny hands to untangle bobbin or thread bobbins and stuff like that. Now, thing about it though is that women and children were actually originally some of the earliest mine workers, right? And the dangers for them were very serious, but children were often used because they could actually fit into small mine shafts and pull carts efficiently. Now, the wages in the mines though were much higher than that of the factories because it was so much dangerous. And one of the other dangers of working in the mines as well is this thing called black lung disease, which is when coal dust would cake all over your lungs and cause eventually cancer or also just like scarring throughout your lungs, and it would actually lead to suffocation, right? Now, the industrial working class though is going to be very, very important, because when we study them, we can see their movements and we can see their population statistics and their wage earning potential, and it kind of really helps us demonstrate or understand the growth of economics, and it also helps us understand the growth of reform as well. Now, romantic and romanticism or romantic artists even had their view of the growing factory society, and they hated it, right? So romantic artists thought it was terrible. Wordsworth actually wrote poetry about how I'd rather sit in a field of daffodils than look at a smokestack any day of the week. And now the other thing about it though as well is that romantic poets also popularized a group of people that actually rebelled against the factory system as well early on. And they were called the Luddites, right? Now, Luddites apparently were these group of people that were based off a very famous story about this guy named Ned Ludd, right? Like the leader of the Luddites, Ned Ludd, who's wearing scraps of, he's not wearing a dress, he's wearing like scraps of textile stuff and as you can see, there's a burning factory in the background, right? But the way the story goes, this guy named Ned Ludd led these people known as the Luddites into factories where they would use tools, axes, pickaxes, and other sharp items and sledgehammers and stuff to break the spinning jennies, to break the water frames, to destroy them, to try and bankrupt the factories so they actually wouldn't be forced to work inside of them, right? So you could see how romantics in the early workers didn't want to work in these factories. However, money is going to be the driving force that eventually forces people to end up finding work in them. Because as the putting out system begins to die because it's inefficient, and as the factory system begins to grow, the only place that these workers had to go was the factory. So a few decades after these Luddites break all this stuff up, their family members are going to be the ones that are forcibly recruited into those factories. Now, massive urbanization is going to be a big thing that happens here as well. You're going to see the growth of cities grow exponentially due to the fact that the steam engines now can actually have factories located inside of the cities. Because remember, earliest factories popped up in the country, but when the steam engine comes along, you can now power a factory with that engine, and all you need is water and coal. And since you only need water and coal, why not place the factory where all the people are, which is in the cities, which is going to drive urbanization because more people are also going to begin to move to cities to find find work. When we're looking right here at a very, very good population graph to use when you're discussing urbanization, that right there is the population of Manchester. And as you can see, Manchester is going to see a huge growth in population as the years progress, right? As the years progress and as the decades go on, you're going to see huge amounts of growth in industrial cities, all right? Now, there are some positives and negatives to the Industrial Revolution overall. Some of our positives include things like more wage earning power throughout the home, the ability to buy minor life luxuries, so you're going to see a boost in the consumer revolution due to the Industrial Revolution because people are now earning more of a consistent wage for their hourly rate versus actually trying to use the putting out system to get as much as they can. Now, wages are going to rise during times of peace. Clothing and diet is going to improve. People are going to have access to more goods and access to more foods and stuff like that inside of urbanized cities that have access to ports. Better health standards are going to begin to rise as well, and there's going to be a drop in infant mortality. Now, this is particularly going to affect the middle and upper class more than anybody else, but by the end of the 1800s and second wave industrialization, it's going to begin to even affect the industrial working class. When we begin to get all of this poop out of the streets and stuff like that, people are also going to have higher life expectancy, but that doesn't really take hold until like the 1880s, all right? So now going into it though, also negatives though of this include child labor, right? Child labor is a bad thing. We shouldn't really have it. I disagree with that sometimes, but we'll discuss that in class, mostly just because I think that y'all, you could learn a few things. Now, anyway, so big thing about it, though, 6 days a week work as well. The average person usually at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution worked 6 days a week, and they worked 11 to 16-hour shifts. So you're talking about working anywhere from 60 hours a week to 70 hours a week. Now, wage stagnation is going to be a big problem as well. They will continue to rise, but during times of war or during times of hyper-mechanization, you're going to see people's wages kind of begin to not increase and plateau, right? Now, remember, plateauing is that word for like a flat, right? Now, so housing markets and food price fluctuations are really going to only affect the poor, which is going to be a massive negative as well. And then also going forward, you're going to see terrible working conditions in the mines and factories and overcrowded cities and the spread of disease. Right now, the original workers, when they begin to move into these cities, and plumbing is not a very, very apt thing that actually works very effectively, you're going to see the spread of diseases like cholera, right? Cholera actually being inside of infected water and causes basically extreme bowel movements in a person so badly that they are dehydrated